I'm Clara Jennings, 33, and it's just past sundown when I drop my hospital badge on the kitchen counter. The blue scrubs still warm from a 12-hour shift, and the ache in my calves humming like an old refrain. The house is quiet, except for the soft whir of the freezer and the muffled tick of the dining room clock. I open the freezer for something easy, chicken tenders, a bag of frozen peas, telling myself I'll plate it the way Maddie likes, neat and simple so her hands won't have to reach far. From the other room, my father calls my name, not loud, not kind. A careful tone that has always meant there's a decision waiting that I won't be invited to make. I set the tray down and listen to the microwave start its low, steady hum, a small sound that steadies me more than it should. In the doorway, I see the long oak table dressed for seriousness, my mother at one end, my father at the other, and Maddie's wheelchair positioned like a fourth chair where guests never sit. Papers have been arranged in tidy stacks, pens lined up parallel to the edge water glasses placed on coasters, as if signatures go down easier with a sip. My father nods at the empty chair and asks me to sit, and I do the elastic of my compression socks digging into my calves, the smell of reheating chicken drifting in from the kitchen. No one asks about my day. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood in a room where everyone seemed to have a plan for your life but you. I grew up only a few neighborhoods over from this dining room in a house where we bowed our heads before every meal and learned to carry casseroles to grieving families because kindness was supposed to travel on foot. My mother taught us to iron our Sunday dresses. My father taught us to shake hands with our eyes lifted, and the lesson beneath all of it was simple: be useful. We didn't have much money when I was little, but we had what my parents called standing, which meant you could lose a paycheck and still show up at church with a smile because people remembered who brought the extra folding chairs. Over time, that standing became its own kind of currency, a way of paying for things without anyone calling it a debt. When Maddie's accident happened, I was the older sister with car keys and a soft spot for stray cats, the one who kept a dish of water behind the park bench, and the story that built itself in the hours after the ambulance left was so plain and easy that it stuck. I was supposed to walk her to the bus. I didn't. She tried to catch it and never made it across the street. I didn't argue with the story. I didn't know how. Grief takes the sharpness out of a voice, and in those months, I traded college brochures for night classes and told anyone who asked that nursing made sense because it was practical and close to home, and most days I believed it. Nursing fit the way chores fit hands, busy head bowed, yet nothing about my work felt small. I learned how to count a pulse by touch and how to keep a frightened patient talking through an IV start, and on the long drives home after late shifts, I'd picture Maddie's room lit by the lamp on her nightstand and tell myself that steadiness was a kind of love. The contrast between the hospital and home grew sharper as the years went on. At Riverbend, the rules were clear, and you signed your name because you'd actually done the work. At home, the rules lived in glances and gentle reminders about duty, and it was understood that a good daughter filled the gaps before anyone asked. Friends moved across the country or chased degrees I used to imagine for myself. And I stayed in Denver because Maddie needed me and because the story said I owed it, and because our community sent cards with Bible verses in looping script that felt like a blessing and a warning both. When I did try to step back when I looked at apartments closer to the hospital or asked about a different unit, someone would mention how hard the week had been for my parents, or how much Maddie's therapies cost, and the plans folded themselves back into my purse like receipts for things I couldn't return. It wasn't dramatic, not then. It was a steady narrowing, the kind that only looks like a path when you keep your eyes on your feet. By the time I turned 33, I could tell you which patients would try to joke their way through pain and which would sit quietly and count their breaths. I could also tell you that a life built on apology asks for interest you don't notice until the bill arrives. My parents' house stayed tidy. The lawn clipped, the Sunday schedule posted on the fridge, and the language of sacrifice, ours mine, was used often enough that it felt like weather, something you endured instead of questioned. Maddie and I found our own rhythm in the middle of it, grocery lists with the heavy items at the top, so I could load them first. Kitchen prep, arranged in a line she could reach. A blog she started that collected adaptive recipes from people we'd never meet. We didn't talk about the day of the accident. Not really, because some stories sit like heavy furniture and you learn to walk around them. On the rare nights I met an old friend for coffee, I would get home to find the porch light left on and a note from my mother beside a stack of insurance forms, a polite reminder that the week ahead was full. It's strange how gently a decade can teach you to forget yourself. The microwave clicks off in the kitchen, and no one moves. My mother slides a stack of paper toward me and lines it up with the edge of my placemat, so the corners meet. My father folds his hands as if beginning. Grace and Maddie turns her chair an inch to the side, the rubber whispering against the floor. The top page is bolded and precise, the kind of title that asks for ink, not questions. My father lifts a pen, sets it near my right hand, and says he'll explain everything once I've had a chance to look, and I glance from one face to the next, measuring the room I've known all my life, and finding no place to set down what's in my chest. The clock in the hallway ticks once, then again, and I realize I'm holding my breath. I lower my eyes to the first line and begin to read. The pen rests near my hand, its barrel gleaming in the light above the dining table. My father's voice is steady practice telling me this agreement is nothing new, only a way of formalizing what has always been expected. I glance at the heading Caregiver Agreement and then at my name written again and again, as if the weight of responsibility could be pressed into the page. My mother explains in a soft tone that my 401k will fund an account for Maddie that I'll add $2,000 every month after that. My chest tightens as I do the math against rent, student loans, and the long shifts I've worked to build some measure of stability. My father says it plainly that I earn more than enough that I owe this because I am the one who caused Maddie's life to change. I hear Maddie's wheelchair shift a faint squeak against the floor, but she does not speak. Her silence hovers like another witness in the room, heavier than the papers themselves. My mother reminds me of that afternoon when I was 16, the cats I fed instead of walking my sister to the bus stop, the delivery truck that struck her when she tried to catch it at the next corner. Every word is familiar. I have heard this story told to me so many times it feels like scripture. Still, my hands tremble as I place my palms flat against the table, trying to hold back the wave of nausea rising with each sentence. I need time to think. I manage, though my voice shakes. My father's brows draw together. He insists there is nothing to think about. My mother leans forward, her tone sharp now, warning that if I refuse, they will tell everyone at the hospital and at church that I'm abandoning my sister. The threat sits between us with a terrible weight sharper than any demand for money. I imagine my supervisor hearing whispers the community that praises me for sacrifice, seeing me marked as selfish. The pen feels heavy when I lift at the tip, hovering above the line where my name belongs. My pulse hammers in my ears. Then, with hands unsteady, I set it down again. My voice is stronger this time when I tell them I'll speak tomorrow. I rise before either can object and leave the dining room, their voices following me down the hall. In my room, I lock the door and slide to the floor, the papers still burning in my mind. The phone screen blurs as I scroll through contacts, searching for a name I have not touched in years. My thumb hesitates, then presses. The ring sounds 3 times before a familiar voice answers. Clara Lauren's tone holds surprise, then concern. It has been so long. She asks if I am all right, and the question breaks open something inside me. The words tumble out in gasps about the papers, the threats, how they want everything I have. She listens without interrupting the silence on her end, solid enough to hold my shaking voice. When I run out of words, she asks one question, calm and direct. Clara, have you ever seen the actual police report from Maddie's accident? I freeze my mind, searching and finding only blankness. No, I whisper. I was 16. They handled everything. I only knew what I was told. The days that follow blur together, but I meet Lauren in a small coffee shop 3 days later. The place smells of roasted beans and warm bread, the chatter around us soft but constant. She looks different now, sharper in a charcoal suit, hair pulled back, eyes focused with the kind of intensity that belongs to someone used to holding the weight of other people's lives. She sets a folder on the table between us. My hands hesitate before reaching for it. The edges are crisp, official. She tells me to read. My throat tightens as I open it and see the first lines. Location, Westridge Road, nearly 4 miles from our neighborhood. Time, 3:42 p.m. Vehicle A, 1998 Honda motorcycle. Driver Tyler Grant, age 17. Passenger Madeline Jennings, age 14. The words blur. I shake my head, searching for the story I've always known. My eyes catch on the witness statements, how Maddie laughed with her arms around Tyler's waist, how they tried to beat the yellow light. The truck had the right of way. The air leaves my lungs all at once. For 11 years, I believed she missed her bus because of me, that she was crossing to catch it when she was struck. Yet here in black and white is the truth: she never went to the bus stop at all. She had been riding on a motorcycle with a boy our parents forbade her to see. I clutch the edges of the folder, the paper cutting into my skin, and try to breathe. Lauren's hand covers mine, steady grounding. "They lied," she says simply. The noise of the coffee shop fades. My vision swims as the years rearrange themselves in my head, missed opportunities, nights at Maddie's side, the guilt that shadowed every choice. 11 years of sacrifice for something that wasn't mine to carry. My stomach churns, and I excuse myself, rushing to the restroom where I barely make it before retching into the sink. Cold water against my face offers no relief. In the mirror, my reflection is hollow eyes wide with something like recognition. When I return, Lauren has ordered me tea. I lower myself into the seat, the folder still on the table. I ask about the hospital records I was never allowed to see. She nods, explaining that from the very beginning, our parents built the story even in the trauma room. My father claimed responsibility belonged to me before doctors had finished their work. My chest aches with the depth of the betrayal. She explains more, that the inheritance from my grandmother, $20,000 meant for me, was taken under the guise of medical expenses, though insurance covered nearly everything. My plans for college postponed the nursing career chosen not for passion, but for convenience. The guilt used to bind me to a path I never truly chose. It all fits together now, piece by piece, the picture sharp and cruel. I listen as she continues telling me my parents are deep in debt, second mortgage, credit cards, my father's job gone months ago. The community does not know. They see only the polished image at church. It explains the sudden pressure, the need for my money now. But the sharpest cut comes when she confirms what I feared Maddie must have known. She was old enough to remember the truth. For 11 years she let me bear the blame, let me believe I was the reason she sat in that chair. The pain of that realization slices deeper than the rest. Lauren's voice softens, but her words are clear. They have no case. Even if the story had been true, the statute of limitations is long past. Their threats hold no weight in court. For the first time in years, a faint glimmer of hope stirs in me. Still, the thought echoes in my chest: if they lied about this, what else has been twisted into truth? She lays out the next steps, each one firm and deliberate. We will gather more statements. Tyler still lives nearby. My Aunt Rosie overheard things at the hospital that day. There are people who can confirm what really happened. And there is a journalist. She trusts someone who has exposed families who exploited others for money before. The plan is larger than I imagined, heavy with the promise of consequences. My hands tremble as I picture what lies ahead. My family's world has been built on a lie for more than a decade, and if I follow this path, that world will crack wide open. Lauren reminds me that this isn't about revenge. It's about freedom. For me, and for Maddie, too. I look at the folder, at the truth that has waited so many years, and know there is no going back. The pages rustle as I close them, the sound like a door shutting firmly behind me. Whatever comes next will not be simple, but it will be real, and the weight I've carried for half my life has finally begun to lift. When I leave the coffee shop, the evening air is cool against my face. I clutch the folder under my arm, the truth pressing close to me as though it has always belonged there. At home, the dining room light glows through the curtains, but I do not step inside. I stand on the porch, a long moment, my breath steady for the first time in days, and think of Maddie's silence at that table. Tomorrow, I will have questions for her too. The folder lay open on my kitchen table long after I returned home, the pages spread like pieces of a puzzle that had been kept from me for more than a decade. My eyes drifted over the witness statements again, the neat black type describing Maddie's laughter on the back of Tyler's motorcycle. Every line contradicted the story my parents had told me since I was 16. I sat motionless, tracing the dates and signatures with my finger, the weight of all those lost years pressing down until I felt I could hardly breathe. For the first time, I let myself picture what those years might have been if I hadn't carried their version of events as truth. The next morning at the hospital, the routine of my shift felt heavier than usual. I charted vitals, administered medications, and checked on patients, but my thoughts were never fully in the room. Every beep of a monitor pulled me back to the memory of Maddie's room after the accident, the machines that had marked each second while my parents whispered their story to anyone who would listen. My colleagues noticed the shadows under my eyes, though no one asked more than the polite, rough night. I nodded and kept moving, but inside my chest, everything ached. When my shift ended, I drove without thinking to the quiet park near our old neighborhood. The benches were weathered, and the playground where we used to play stood nearly empty in the late afternoon sun. I sat alone watching the branches sway and thought about the years I had traded college dreams, a chance to live somewhere else. Even small things like weekends spent traveling with friends. Each choice had been shaped by guilt pressed into me, by reminders that I owed Maddie everything. Now the truth unraveled, that foundation, leaving me unsure of who I had been all this time. The guilt had been my compass, but without it, the horizon was wide and uncertain. That night, I could barely eat. I moved through my apartment, turning lights on and off, without reason sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands clenched in my lap. I thought of the nights I stayed awake beside Maddie's hospital bed, whispering promises that I would always take care of her, that it was my fault she lay there unable to move. I thought of the mornings when I walked past friends with backpacks heading to class, while I went to work long shifts, convinced that I was repaying a debt. Each memory carried a new sting now, because I knew those sacrifices had been demanded on a false foundation. The silence in my apartment pressed in, and for a moment I felt the weight of being entirely alone with the truth. On Sunday, I joined Maddie and my parents at church, sliding into the pew as though nothing had changed. My father shook hands with neighbors, his voice booming with cheer, while my mother arranged bulletins with practiced grace. Maddie sat beside me, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I looked at her profile, searching for something: remorse, hesitation, any flicker that might tell me she had struggled with the lie too. But she only nodded politely at those who greeted her, the picture of composure. My throat tightened as Pastor Brooks spoke about truth and forgiveness, words that cut differently now. I bowed my head with the rest, but inside the silence rang louder than any prayer. That afternoon, I avoided the house, driving instead to the grocery store and wandering aisles I didn't need. I stared at shelves of canned soup and cereal boxes, but what filled my mind was the realization that Maddie had known all along. She had been 14, not a child too young to remember. She must have remembered Tyler's motorcycle, the laughter, the way the accident unfolded. Yet for 11 years she let me bear the burden alone. I thought of the moment she whispered apologies to me late at night, words that never made sense then, but now felt heavy with hidden meaning. The betrayal from her silence cut deeper than I wanted to admit. When I returned home, the house was quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my cup of tea. My hands trembled as I thought of what Lauren had said about my parents' finances, about their desperation, and the lies built to protect their image. None of it excused the years I had lost the weight I had carried, or the life I had reshaped around penance. The more I turned it over in my mind, the clearer it became this was not just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It had been deliberate, and I was only beginning to uncover how deep it went. Later that night I tried to sleep, but found myself replaying old moments in sharp detail. The day I signed away my inheritance, believing it was for Maddie's care. The evenings when my father praised me in front of others for my sacrifice, while privately reminding me it was nothing more than duty. The birthdays I spent working extra shifts to cover expenses, my parents said insurance wouldn't touch. Each memory now had a new edge, reframed by the knowledge that so much of it had been built on lies. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of betrayal pressing down like a stone. By Monday morning, exhaustion clung to me as I dressed for work, but beneath it stirred something I hadn't felt before. The ache was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer the dull guilt I had lived with for years. It was sharper, more precise, like the first stirrings of anger pushing against the walls I had built to contain it. I glanced at the folder still on the table, the truth spread out in neat lines and official signatures. For years I had lived under their story. Now I had my own. And though I didn't yet know what steps would follow, I knew I couldn't go back to silence. I arrived at the hospital early, moving through the quiet halls before the day began. The smell of disinfectant and the hum of machines surrounded me, familiar and grounding. I slipped into an empty break room, the folder tucked in my bag, and sat with my coffee growing cold. I thought of 16-year-old me sitting in Maddie's hospital room, promising to carry a burden that was never mine. That girl deserved more than the silence that had been forced upon her. And so did I. When my shift ended, I walked out into the crisp evening air and pulled my coat tighter around me. The city lights flickered on one by one, and I felt the weight of a choice forming. I could continue as before, carrying their lie as though it was truth, or I could begin to pull it apart, piece by piece. The thought was terrifying, but it was also the first breath of freedom I had felt in years. As I stood there, watching the traffic move steady and endless, I knew something had shifted inside me. The silence I had lived with for 11 years was no longer bearable, and the time was coming when I would have to break it. Lauren and I sat in her office late into the evening, the walls lined with files and shelves of law books. A whiteboard stretched across one side, and she began mapping out what we had so far. My eyes followed the lines she drew, each name and date, pulling the past into sharp relief. At the center, she wrote one word in bold letters: accident. From there, arrows reached out to the police report, to Tyler's testimony, to Maddie's silence, and to my parents' financial choices. It looked less like a family tragedy and more like a carefully constructed plan. The next step was contacting Tyler. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I pulled up his profile online. The smiling photos of his wife and children made it difficult to connect him with the boy I remembered from high school. Still, I typed a short message asking if he had been with Maddie that day. The reply came faster than I expected. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a call. His voice was older, steadier, but carried a hesitation that reminded me of years past. He confessed before I could ask more than a single question. Maddie had begged him to hide the truth. My parents had cornered him at the hospital, threatening charges if he admitted she had been on his motorcycle without a helmet. For 11 years, he carried his own quiet guilt, waiting for someone to ask. His words confirmed everything in the report, but hearing it directly sent a chill through me. By the end of the call, he promised to write a statement and have it notarized. Lauren squeezed my shoulder after I hung up. "One more piece," she said quietly. The next call was to Aunt Rosie. Her voice trembled as she answered, but when I explained why I needed her, something steadied on the other end of the line. She told me how she had overheard my parents in the hallway that day creating the bus stop story before Maddie had even been wheeled into surgery. She admitted she had kept it to herself all these years, afraid of breaking the family apart. Her apology was soft but unyielding, and by the end of the call, she agreed to give us a written statement. Each truth stacked on the other, fragile but undeniable. By Sunday afternoon, I stood in my parents' living room with the folder clutched in my hands. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood filled the air, but the space felt smaller than it ever had. My father looked up from his chair, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the papers. "What's going on?" he asked. My voice was steadier than I felt when I told them I knew. I laid the report on the table, watching the color drain from his face. My mother was the first to recover, smoothing her skirt with sharp, deliberate movements. She claimed they had only been protecting Maddie from scandal, that I was old enough to shoulder the responsibility. The words rang hollow in the air, even as my father insisted it didn't change my obligation. My hands shook, but my voice did not falter. I told them I would not sign, not now, not ever. Then I turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing like a final judgment. Lauren was waiting in her car at the curb. The look on her face shifted when she saw me. Something in my posture told her what had happened. "You look lighter," she said softly as I slid into the seat. I hadn't realized until then how much the confrontation had lifted from me. Tears came suddenly, but they were not the same as before. They felt like release, like a poison draining out after years of being held in. Lauren started the engine, her words calm and certain. "This is just the beginning. We're going to set it all right." The days that followed were filled with preparation. Ethan joined us at Lauren's office, his recorder ready, his journalist's eye picking up details I might have overlooked. He spread manila folders across the table, each filled with bank records and financial statements. We traced the money I had given them, comparing it to Maddie's actual medical expenses. Less than half had gone to her care. The rest had been diverted to mortgage payments, credit cards, even a fishing boat my father had purchased 3 years earlier. There were payments on a vacation timeshare in Florida. Each discovery hardened something inside me, replacing guilt with resolve. What had felt like a family duty was now revealed as fraud. Lauren kept us focused, laying out the evidence as if preparing for trial. "Emotional confrontations won't work," she reminded me more than once. "We need documentation, witnesses, and a clear pattern." I listened, my nursing training echoing her words. It was no longer about feelings alone. It was a case built piece by piece, just like diagnosing a patient. Ethan uncovered claims filed to insurance companies for treatments that never happened. Lauren spoke with my colleagues, gathering their statements about the exhaustion they had witnessed over the years. Each new piece of evidence wove into the timeline we had drawn, the picture sharpening until there was no space left for denial. The call from the hospital came on a Thursday morning. My supervisor, Shelley, asked me to come to HR immediately. The tone in her voice left no room for delay. I arrived to find my parents had called the ethics hotline, accusing me of stealing prescription medications for personal profit. For a moment, the world tilted under me. Years of work, my entire career threatened by a single accusation. I sat across from Shelley as security reviewed the access logs, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Within an hour, it was clear. Every record showed proper procedure. Every camera confirmed my actions. Shelley closed the file and looked at me with quiet sympathy. "There's no merit to this," she said firmly. Relief rushed through me, but beneath it came a sharper understanding. My parents would go as far as they had to, no matter the cost. Outside the hospital, Lauren stood waiting by her car. She reached for my hand as soon as I stepped out, her grip firm. "They're trying to break you," she said, "because they know you have the truth." The clarity in her words steadied me. The guilt I had carried for so long had given them power. Now it was evidence that would dismantle everything they had built. That night, I spread the documents across Lauren's conference table, the timeline stretching neatly from one end to the other. At the center, I placed the police report, the foundation of every lie undone. For the first time, I saw not only the damage they had done, but also the strength we had gathered. We were ready. And as I stared at the board covered with names, dates, and signatures, I understood something I hadn't before: they would not surrender quietly. The next move was theirs, and I needed to be ready for whatever storm they brought. 3 days after the hospital cleared me of my parents' false accusations, I sat once again in Lauren's conference room. The table was buried in binders, financial statements, and sworn testimonies, each page carrying the weight of years of silence. The whiteboard behind her displayed our timeline, 11 years, stretched in neat rows of dates and arrows. Ethan tapped his pen against the edge of the table, his expression serious, as he reviewed the forged mortgage document. "This isn't just manipulation," he said quietly. "It's criminal." I studied my father's handwriting in the forged signature line, the pressure points so familiar they seemed to echo his grip on my shoulder when I was younger. Lauren adjusted her glasses, her voice calm but precise. "We filed the restraining order, and that will hold for now. But we need to be ready for their next move. They won't stop here." I nodded, the truth of it already proven. They had tried to destroy my career with a phone call. They would not hesitate to go further. My eyes moved over the binders again. Jason's statement about the accident, Rosie's testimony about the hallway conversation, Tyler's notarized letter confirming Maddie's choice that day. Every piece of evidence was another stone pried out of the wall my parents had built. The following morning, as I was leaving for work, Lauren called with news. My parents had retained an attorney, Amanda Keene, a name even I recognized. She was known for aggressive tactics in family support cases. They filed a demand letter. Lauren explained, her tone clipped. They're pushing for a court-ordered caregiver agreement. They're threatening to petition for guardianship of Maddie if you don't comply. My knees went weak at the thought. Guardianship! The word carried a cold weight. If they succeeded, it would give them control over Maddie's care, her benefits, and her choices. That evening, Lauren and Ethan sat with me at the polished conference table reviewing the letter line by line. Amanda's arguments were clear: moral obligation, financial ability, family duty. Lauren's pen underlined each section as she explained why none of it could hold in court. They're hoping you'll break under pressure, she said, her voice firm. Legal fees, public embarrassment, that's their strategy, but the law is on your side. Ethan leaned forward. The more desperate they get, the more reckless they'll become. That only strengthens our case. I listened, my hands clasped tightly together, forcing myself to breathe evenly. By Saturday, the situation escalated again. Lauren received word that my parents had begun contacting extended relatives and church elders, setting the stage for a family meeting. She showed me the email forwarded by a cousin. My parents claimed I was abandoning Maddie, that I refused to support her care despite earning a good salary. They invited everyone to our house for a discussion. My chest tightened as I read it. This wasn't a private fight anymore. They were drawing in the entire family, even the church community, to force me into compliance. We met the next day at Lauren's office to prepare. Ethan spread new folders across the table, each filled with organized evidence. If they want an audience, we'll give them the truth, he said. Lauren outlined the plan carefully. I would attend the meeting, listen, and wait. When the pressure came, we would present the evidence not with anger, but with facts. Aunt Rosie agreed to join us, her statement ready. Even Jason had offered to appear if needed. The weight of it pressed on me, but for the first time, I felt more prepared than afraid. On Wednesday evening, I dressed in navy slacks and a simple blouse, my hands trembling as I buttoned the cuffs. My phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. We're in position. Stay calm. I tucked it into my pocket and drove to my parents' house, the porch light glowing in the early dusk. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into something like a tribunal. Extra chairs lined the table, each place set with water glasses and notepads. My father stood at the head in his Sunday suit, his voice warm as he greeted relatives, neighbors, and Pastor Brooks. My mother handed out stapled packets of medical bills, her expression practiced and grave. Maddie sat quietly at the far side, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. My father began with words he had likely rehearsed. He spoke of duty, of hardship, of my supposed refusal to contribute. My mother passed out bills that were already covered by insurance, presenting them as proof of overwhelming need. Pastor Brooks leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Clara," he said softly, "surely we can find a solution that honors your family obligations." Relatives shook their heads, disappointed, their eyes on me, as if I had turned my back on Maddie. The air grew heavy, each word another brick in the wall of pressure they were building. A manila folder slid across the table toward me. Their attorney, Amanda Keene, folded her hands neatly. "This agreement will ensure Maddie's care," she said smoothly. "All it requires is your signature. Everyone here understands what's at stake." The eyes around the table followed me, waiting. My heart pounded, but my voice came steady. "Before anyone signs anything, I said I'd like to introduce someone." The doorbell rang on cue. My mother's frown deepened as she moved to the door. In stepped Lauren, every inch the professional, her briefcase in hand. Ethan followed, his recorder visible, and behind them Aunt Rosie, her expression pale but determined. The room fell into uneasy silence. My father's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the back of his chair. "This is a private family matter," he said sharply. Lauren set her case on the table, her tone even. "Then why invite church elders and your attorney? If it is truly private, it would have stayed that way." Pastor Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his gaze moving between us. Ethan set his recorder on the edge of the table. Aunt Rosie took her place beside me, her hands folded but steady. I opened my folder and placed the police report in the center of the table. "The accident didn't happen at the bus stop," I said, my voice calm, though my pulse raced. It happened nearly 4 miles away on Tyler Grant's motorcycle. Maddie skipped the bus that day. My parents knew from the beginning. They built a story, and they made me carry it for 11 years. The room stilled. Pastor Brooks leaned closer, his face pale. "Is this true, Robert?" My father's mouth opened, but no words came. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Maddie lifted her head for the first time, her eyes wet with tears. Her voice trembled, but carried clearly. "I skipped the bus. I rode with Tyler. Mom and Dad said Clara would be blamed, and I let them do it." Her words cracked the silence open. Relatives shifted uneasily, their expressions changing as they scanned the documents Lauren and Ethan passed around. Aunt Rosie added her voice, confessing what she had overheard that day at the hospital. Pastor Brooks closed his Bible softly, his voice heavy. "This betrayal goes against everything we stand for." My father's shoulders slumped, the careful mask slipping. The room that had been built to shame me now stared at them with disappointment and disbelief. I reached for Maddie's hand, my voice steady. "I never abandoned you. I just couldn't live with the lies anymore." Tears streamed down her face as she gripped my hand tightly. The weight that had been mine alone began to lift piece by piece. Around us, the authority my parents had wielded for so long dissolved into silence. But even as I sat there holding my sister's hand in a room that finally knew the truth, I knew it was not the end. My parents would not simply walk away. They would fight to keep control, even as their lies unraveled. And the next battle was already forming, one that would test every boundary I had begun to build. When the last chair scraped back from the table and the voices faded, I stayed seated beside Maddie, her hand still gripping mine. The living room was quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock. My parents had walked out without looking back, their carefully polished image crumbling in front of relatives and church elders who once admired them. I exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing against my ribs, loosening just enough to let air in. Maddie leaned closer, her voice raw. "What happens now?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew the silence we had lived with was broken for good. The following morning, Lauren called me to her office. Ethan was already there, spreading out new documents across the table. "Your parents are desperate," he said, his tone clipped. "They won't give up quietly." Lauren opened a folder and slid it toward me. It contained the forged mortgage paperwork, the signature so clearly mimicking my own that it made my stomach clench. "We've confirmed with the bank's examiner," she explained. "It's a forgery. That crosses the line from manipulation into fraud." I studied the document, the looping strokes my father had tried to replicate. For years I had thought his control ended at words. Now I saw it etched in ink on paper. Ethan tapped another section of the timeline pinned to the board. "We've matched your contributions to the expenses they claimed. Less than 40% went to Maddie's care. The rest went to their mortgage credit cards and a vacation timeshare." His words hung heavy, though my heart no longer sank with each revelation. I felt something steadier building inside me, the shift from guilt into resolve. Lauren leaned back, her expression unreadable. "They're cornered. That means they'll escalate. We need to be ready." The phone on her desk rang, breaking the silence. She listened, her jaw tightening, then handed me the receiver. "This is Melissa from HR," the voice on the line said. "We need you to come in regarding serious allegations." My grip on the phone tightened. When I asked what kind, she paused before answering. "Your father reported that you've been stealing prescription medications for profit." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I ended the call with a promise to come immediately, then turned to Lauren and Ethan. My voice shook only once when I said, "They're trying to destroy me." 2 hours later, I sat in HR's office, across from Shelley, my supervisor. Security reviewed access logs, checking every medication I had dispensed. My chest tightened as the minutes stretched on, but slowly the tension began to ease. Every record was clear. Every camera confirmed my actions. Shelley closed the folder and looked directly at me. "There's nothing here," she said firmly. "These allegations are baseless." Relief washed over me, but it was laced with something sharper, the certainty that my parents were willing to drag my career through the mud if it meant regaining control. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Lauren walked beside me, her heels clicking against the pavement. "They wanted you to panic," she said, her voice steady. "Instead, you walked out with your reputation intact." I nodded, the air cool against my face. For years they had counted on my silence. Now I had facts, witnesses, and the strength to stand. That night back in Lauren's office, we spread the evidence across the polished mahogany table. Jason's sworn testimony about the motorcycle accident, Rosie's statement about the hospital hallway, Maddie's own words at the family meeting, the forged mortgage, the financial records, the fraudulent insurance claims. The pattern was clear, a decade of deceit reduced to paper and signatures. Ethan leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not just exposing a lie, we're dismantling a fraud." Lauren placed her hand flat on the table. "We need to decide how to move forward, confront them in court, or give them the chance to step back on their own." I thought of the years I had lost, of the nights spent whispering apologies into Maddie's darkened room, believing her life was my burden to carry. I thought of the forged signature, the false accusation, the lies woven into sermons and church meetings. My voice came steady when I said, "No more time, no more lies." The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Ethan interviewed church members who had donated to Maddie's care fund, many of them shocked to learn how their money had been used. Lauren drafted the guardianship papers to secure Maddie's financial independence, ensuring my parents could no longer intercept her benefits. I visited Maddie in the evening, sitting with her as she began to imagine a life not dictated by our parents' control. She spoke of applying for disability benefits, of living in a space designed for her, not for appearances. For the first time in years, her shoulders seemed to lift, the curve of apology easing from her posture. One evening, as we sat at her small kitchen table, Maddie asked softly, "Do you think they'll ever admit what they've done?" I looked at her, the light catching on her damp lashes. "They might never," I said gently. "But the truth is out now. They can't bury it again." She nodded, her hand resting on mine, and in that moment I saw not the sister I had carried in guilt, but a woman ready to stand beside me in truth. By the end of the week, our binders were filled, every piece of evidence tagged and indexed. The timeline stretched neatly across Lauren's whiteboard, 11 years of lies dismantled step by step. I studied it late one night, my eyes following the arrows that began with the accident and ended with forged signatures and false accusations. The weight on my shoulders was still heavy, but it no longer felt like mine alone. As I closed the binder and turned off the office lights, I knew the next confrontation was coming. My parents had lost the community's trust, their hold on Maddie, and their ability to manipulate me through guilt. Their only weapon left was desperation, and desperation, I had learned, could be dangerous. The week after the confrontation, my apartment felt quieter than usual. I sat at the kitchen table most nights, binders stacked in front of me, the truth laid out in organized pages. Lauren called often, her steady voice keeping me anchored, while Ethan worked late into the evenings, piecing together the financial trail. For the first time in years, the guilt that had guided every choice no longer pressed down with the same suffocating weight. In its place was something clearer, a determination that this time my parents wouldn't control the story. One evening, Ethan arrived at Lauren's office with another discovery. He set a stack of highlighted bank statements in front of me, his expression grim. "It wasn't just the mortgage and the timeshare," he said quietly. "They used donations from the church fund to cover their own debts." My breath caught as I scanned the numbers. Payments for utilities, credit cards, even installments on the boat. Lauren drew a neat line down the page, separating Maddie's actual care costs from the rest. "This is misappropriation of charitable funds," she explained. "Once Pastor Brooks and the church board see this, they'll have no choice but to investigate formally." By Friday, the decision was made. Lauren filed for financial guardianship on Maddie's behalf, ensuring her benefits would be safeguarded from interception. Ethan prepared a draft of his article, careful and precise, every claim supported by documents and testimony. The thought of it going public filled me with both dread and relief. For so long, the fear of exposure had been used as a weapon against me. Now, exposure was the path to freedom. That weekend, Maddie and I met at her therapist's office to discuss the guardianship paperwork. She wheeled herself into the small room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes searched mine before she spoke. "Clara, I should have told you years ago. I was scared, but I knew the truth. I let you carry it alone." Her words shook, but she held my gaze. I reached across the space, covering her hand with mine. "We can't change what's past," I said softly. "But we can change what happens now." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded, signing the papers with a trembling hand. The following Monday, Lauren called me into her office again. She slid an envelope across the desk. "The court approved the petition," she said. "Maddie's finances will be handled independently from this point forward. Your parents no longer have legal access." Relief spread through me, slow and steady. For the first time in 11 years, Maddie's future wasn't tethered to their control. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "They've lost their hold. Now we decide how to close the door for good." News traveled quickly through our church community. Pastor Brooks called a special board meeting to review the records Ethan had compiled. I wasn't there, but Lauren attended, her presence steady as the documents were passed from hand to hand. Later that evening, she called to tell me the outcome. "The board is opening a formal investigation into misuse of funds," she said. "Your parents are suspended from all financial responsibilities until it's complete." I sat on my couch, the phone pressed to my ear, absorbing the words. The authority my parents had wielded for so long within the church was gone in a single evening. Days later, Maddie moved into a new apartment fitted with accessible counters, wide doorways, and space that was truly hers. I carried boxes through the front door while she wheeled herself across the threshold, her expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. "Is this really mine?" she asked softly, her hand brushing the smooth countertop. "All yours," I answered, setting the box down. The insurance settlement had covered the modifications, and for the first time Maddie's living space reflected her independence rather than our parents' control. That night, as we unpacked dishes into the cabinets, she paused by the window overlooking a small garden. "Dad called me again," she said, her voice quiet. He sounded desperate. I slid another plate onto the shelf, my movements steady. "They should be worried," I replied. Pastor Brooks and the church board had already begun investigating, and Lauren was preparing to submit the financial evidence to state authorities. My parents' world was collapsing piece by piece. 2 weeks later, I stood in the back of the church hall during a community meeting. Ethan sat near the front with his recorder, Lauren, by his side. Pastor Brooks addressed the congregation, his voice heavy. "We have reviewed records that reveal serious misuse of funds meant for Maddie Jennings' care. The board will ensure proper oversight moving forward. Trust has been broken, and accountability must follow." I watched the faces around the room, neighbors who had believed my parents' story for over a decade. Their expressions shifted from confusion to anger, the betrayal settling in like a cold wind. After the meeting, several members approached me quietly. Some offered words of support, others simple nods of acknowledgement. Each gesture carried a weight I hadn't expected. For years I had been seen as the responsible sister, the one who owed a debt that could never be repaid. Now they saw me differently, not as a failure, but as someone who had carried more than anyone should. Later that evening, I returned to Maddie's apartment. She was waiting at the table with 2 mugs of tea, her shoulders straighter than I'd seen in years. "I applied for disability benefits today," she said proudly. "The ones they always said I couldn't qualify for without you." I smiled, sitting across from her. "And?" Her grin widened. "Turns out I've been eligible for a decade. They just never told me." We laughed softly, the sound carrying into the quiet apartment. For the first time, our conversations were about the future, not the past. Ethan's article was published the following week. The headline was stark, the story detailed and unflinching. It named my parents, documented the lies, and laid bare the financial trail that led from community donations to personal luxuries. By evening, the article had spread through the city, shared across social media, and discussed in hushed tones at the hospital where I worked. Shelley caught my eye during shift change, her expression firm but kind. "You did the right thing," she said simply. Her words anchored me, a quiet reminder that truth carried its own kind of strength. That night, As I drove home beneath the glow of streetlights, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from my father. Just 2 words. "We're done." My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I read them. The silence of years had been shattered, the lies exposed, but the cost was now clear. Whatever relationship we had left was gone. I parked outside my apartment and sat for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. My parents' hold was broken, their image dismantled, but the ache of finality lingered. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine life without their shadow overhead, and as I stepped out into the night air, I understood that what lay ahead would not be about them anymore. It would be about what Maddie and I built, from the truth we had reclaimed. But even in that moment of quiet, I knew one more step remained. The public reckoning was over, yet the personal reckoning between sisters, between parents and children, had only just begun. The months after the public reckoning passed quietly, though the silence felt different now. I was no longer waiting for the next demand or accusation. Instead, my days filled with work classes and the kind of calm routines I had once thought impossible. Maddie settled into her new apartment with surprising ease, the small garden view from her window becoming her favorite place to sit in the evenings. Sometimes I joined her there, and we talked about the future instead of the past. 6 months later, I stood at the front of Riverbend's trauma unit, leading orientation for a group of new nurses. My scrubs were the same familiar blue, but the woman wearing them was not the same one who had walked into that conference room months earlier. I told the new nurses that their greatest duty was to advocate for their patients, even when that meant standing against family members who claimed to know best. I could feel the truth of those words deep in my chest. That night, Maddie invited me over for dinner. She had cooked lasagna from her wheelchair, a meal that filled her apartment with warmth. As we ate, she told me about the disability advocacy course she had enrolled in. She was already helping 2 families navigate the system our parents had once exploited. Her voice carried pride, steady and sure, and I realized how much she had grown since the day she signed those guardianship papers with trembling hands. Our parents still called from time to time, but Maddie had learned to answer with boundaries of her own. "I'll consider a relationship," she told them, "when you take responsibility and make amends." Each time they tried to shift the blame back onto us, she stood firm. Watching her strength rise alongside mine was a kind of healing I hadn't expected. On the 1-year anniversary of the confrontation, Maddie and I drove to the city park where I used to feed stray cats as a teenager. The autumn leaves crunched under her wheels as I guided her along the path to the small clearing. "Remember how they said the accident happened because of the cats?" I asked. Maddie laughed softly, her breath visible in the crisp air. And now look at us turning their lie into a place of truth. That fall, the Reed Sisters Foundation opened its doors. Funded in part by a settlement with our parents' insurance company, it provided grants for accessibility modifications and legal aid for families caught in the same traps we had lived through. The first time Maddie spoke at one of our events, she told the room, "The heaviest burden wasn't my paralysis, it was the lies. Now the truth belongs to us." The audience applauded, but I found myself watching her, marveling at the sister I had almost lost under years of silence. When I think back to those years, I realized justice wasn't just about proving what really happened. It was about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that had been buried under guilt and fear. For me, it meant stepping into my own life without apology. For Maddie, it meant learning she could stand tall in her chair without depending on our parents' control. The night we celebrated the Foundation's first grant, Maddie leaned against me on the patio outside her apartment. The sky was filled with stars, quiet and unchanging. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Lauren hadn't asked about the police report?" she asked. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "The truth always finds its way out," I told her. "It was too big to stay hidden forever." She smiled, and for the first time in years, I believed we were both free. Looking back, I see now that carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you is one of the heaviest loads a person can bear. And letting it go doesn't just lighten your steps, it gives you the strength to build something new. Justice, in our case, wasn't a single moment of victory. It was a series of choices, small, steady, deliberate, that turned shame into freedom. If you've listened this far, I wonder about you. Have you ever carried a weight that wasn't truly yours? If you have, I hope this story reminds you that you don't have to keep carrying it. Sometimes justice is simply the act of setting it down. Before I go, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed so we can share more moments of truth together.